The day of reckoning had arrived. The president knew that a media storm was about to erupt, and it did. Now, if you're looking for evidence on which to base an inference about the president's intentions with respect to Ms. Curry's testimony, look what he said to her when he knew that she was going before the grand jury. And I remember when I knew she was going to have to testify in the grand jury, and I felt terrible because she'd been through the loss of her sister, this horrible accident at Christmas that killed her brother, and her mother was in the hospital. I was trying to make her understand that I didn't want her to be untruthful to the grand jury. And if her memory was different than mine, it was fine. Just go in there and tell them what she thought. So that's all I remember. The President of the United States did not tamper with a witness. Now next, the managers argue that Mr. Clinton corruptly encouraged Ms. Lewinsky to submit a false affidavit to the Jones lawyers and to lie if she were ever deposed. But the uncontroverted evidence refutes that charge. Indeed, Ms. Lewinsky herself has repeatedly and forcefully denied that anyone ever asked her to lie. There's no way to get around that flat denial, even with the independent counsel's addition of the word explicitly. There was no explicit, implicit, or any other direction to Ms. Lewinsky to lie. Indeed, the only person to whom Ms. Lewinsky said anything inconsistent with her denial was the ubiquitous Ms. Tripp. And as Ms. Lewinsky later told the grand jury, I think I told her that, at various times the president and Mr. Jordan had told me I have to lie. That wasn't true. Now, left with this record, the managers resort to arguing that Ms. Lewinsky understood that the president wanted her to lie, because he could not have wanted her to file an affidavit detailing their relationship. But the only factual support for this theory cited by the majority is the testimony of Ms. Lewinsky that while the president never encouraged her to lie, he remained silent about what she should have to say or do. And by such silence, she said, I knew what he meant. The very idea that the President of the United States should face removal from office not because he told Monica Lewinsky to lie or anything of the sort, but because he was silent and Ms. Lewinsky, quote, knew what that meant, unquote, is, I suggest, more than troubling. And so to bolster their flawed I knew what he meant theory, the managers assert that the president knew the affidavit would have to be false in order for Ms. Lewinsky to avoid testifying. But the evidence here, too, is that the president repeatedly testified that Ms. Lewinsky could and would file a truthful affidavit. And of course, Ms. Lewinsky herself has made it clear that her definition of the critical terms that might be used in such an affidavit was consistent with the president's. Further testimony from Ms. Lewinsky herself repudiates any suggestion that she was ever encouraged by anyone to lie if she were deposed in the Jones case. In a colloquy with a grand juror, she explicitly and unequivocally rejected the notion that President Clinton encouraged her to deny the relationship after she was learned she was a witness. Referring to discussions about the so-called cover stories that the managers allege were to be used in her testimony, a grand jury asked her, it is possible that you had these discussions after you learned that you were a witness in the Paula Jones case? Answer, I don't believe so, no. Question, can you exclude that possibility? Answer, I pretty much can. Now, the managers would have you conclude the contrary from a brief snippet of the conversation on December 17th, in which Ms. Lewinsky said that at some point, I don't know if it was before or after the subject of the affidavit came up, the president sort of said, well, you know, you can always say you were coming to see Betty or that you were bringing me letters. But Ms. Lewinsky told the FBI when she was interviewed, to the best, this is the FBI talking, to the best of Ms. Lewinsky's memory, she does not believe they discussed in this December 17th conversation the content of any deposition that Ms. Lewinsky might be involved in at a later date. And she told the grand jury the same thing. Describing the very same December 17th conversation, she testified that she and the president did not discuss the idea of her denying their relationship. Ms. Lewinsky, I really don't remember it. I mean, it would be very surprising for me to be confronted with something that would show me different. But it was 2:30, and the conversation I'm thinking of mainly would have been December 17th, which was, and a juror interjects, the telephone call. Ms. Lewinsky, right. And it was, 2:30 in the morning. I remember the gist of it, and I really don't think so. And it is on that basis that the managers suggest to you that the president obstructed justice. Fourth, Article 2 alleges that the president obstructed justice by denying to his closest aides that he had a sexual relationship with Monica Lewinsky. The very same denial he made to his family and his friends and the American people. These allegedly impeachable denials took place in the immediate aftermath of the public revelation of the Lewinsky matter, at the very time that the president was denying that relationship to the entire country on national television. Having made the announcement to the whole country, it is simply absurd, I suggest to you, to believe that he was somehow attempting corruptly to influence his senior staff when he told them virtually the same thing at the same time. Now, the managers do not allege, as they could not, that the president attempted to influence the aides' testimony about what they themselves knew concerning his relationship with Ms. Lewinsky. Had they seen her in a particular place? Had they talked to her? Had they talked to the president about it before all of this broke? Indeed, the only evidence these aides had was the very same denial that the entire American people had. Indeed, every member of the grand jury had probably seen this denial by the president on their own television sets. Under the theory proffered by the managers, in essence, every person who heard the president's denial could have been called to the grand jury in order to create still an additional charge of obstruction of justice. The point here was not that the president believed that his staff would be witnesses and that he somehow wanted to influence their testimony. As he explained to the grand jury, what he was trying to do was avoid making them witnesses. But of course, he had to say something to them. He had to say, in the aftermath of January 21st, something to reassure them. And he told them exactly what he told every one of you and everyone in the gallery and everyone who watched television in those days following January 21st. And let me just make this one point. There's absolutely no conflict in the evidence here, despite the manager's somewhat puzzling suggestion that the Senate's deliberations would somehow be aided if two of the senior staff members could be called as witnesses. And not only is there no conflict in the evidence, there's absolutely no basis for the charge that the president was in any way seeking to influence the testimony of his staff before the grand jury. And now we come to the last of the obstruction charges. The managers ask you to find that the President of the United States employed his friend, Vernon Jordan, to get Monica Lewinsky a job in New York to influence her testimony, or perhaps in a somewhat forlorn effort to escape the reach of the federal rules of civil procedure, actually to hide her from the Jones lawyers in the 8 million people that live in that city. There is, of course, absolutely no evidence to support this conclusion, and so the managers have constructed out of sealing wax and string and spiders' webs a theory that would lend to a series of otherwise innocuous, indeed exculpatory events a dark and sinister cast. The undisputed record establishes the following. 1, Ms. Lewinsky's New York job search began on her own initiative. 2, the search began long before her involvement in the Jones case. 3, the search had no connection to the Jones case. 4, Vernon Jordan agreed to help her, not at the direction of the president, but at the request of Ms. Curry, Mr. Jordan's longtime friend. And 5, the idea to solicit Mr. Jordan's assistance again came not from the president, but from Ms. Tripp. As I thought about this particular aspect of it, I have to say I was sort of reminded of Iago and Desdemona's handkerchief, but we'll pass on. Both Ms. Lewinsky and Mr. Jordan have repeatedly testified that there was never an agreement, a suggestion, an implication that Ms. Lewinsky would be rewarded with a job for her silence or her false testimony. As Mr. Jordan succinctly put it, quote, unequivocally, indubitable, no. It was only to appease Ms. Tripp that Ms. Lewinsky ultimately told her that she had told Mr. Jordan she wouldn't sign the affidavit until she had a job. But as she told the grand jury, quote, that was definitely a lie, based on something that Linda had made me promise on January 9th. Now, although the managers dismiss as irrelevant Ms. Lewinsky's job search before December, the fact is that Ms. Lewinsky had contemplated looking for a job in New York as early as July 1997, and her interest was strengthened in early October when Ms. Tripp told her that it was unlikely that she'd ever get another job in the White House. And it was then that Ms. Tripp and Ms. Lewinsky discussed the prospect of having Vernon Jordan help her get a job in New York, and Ms. Lewinsky mentioned that idea to the president. Later in October, part of this ongoing search, then UN Ambassador Richardson agreed to interview Ms. Lewinsky at the suggestion of then Deputy Chief of Staff Podesta, who had been asked to help by Ms. Curry. And Ambassador Richardson offered her a job. And she had that job in hand throughout the supposedly critical December timeframe. Didn't actually turn it down until early January. And further, in late October, early November, she actually went to her boss at the Pentagon and asked for his help to find a job in New York. But meanwhile, and now we come to what for the managers is the very heart of their case. On November 5th, Ms. Lewinsky had a preliminary meeting with Mr. Jordan, and they discussed a list of potential employers. And all the managers then contend that nothing happened from November 5th, that first meeting, until December 11th, signifying, as they see it, that it must have been Ms. Lewinsky's appearance on the witness list that galvanized Mr. Jordan into action. That's simply false. Ms. Lewinsky had a follow-up telephone conversation with Mr. Jordan around Thanksgiving, in which he told her he was working on the job search, and asked her to call him in the first week of December. You'll remember that the president learned that Ms. Lewinsky was on the Jones witness list sometime on December 6th. He met with Mr. Jordan the very next day, December 7th. But oddly, if one adopts the manager's view, there was no discussion of Ms. Lewinsky or the Jones case, much less job searches. And then on December 8th, Ms. Lewinsky called Mr. Jordan's office and made an appointment to meet with him on December 11th. Now, the president had absolutely nothing to do with that call or that appointment, and Mr. Jordan denied that there was any intensified effort to find Ms. Lewinsky a job. He said, "Oh no, I do not recall any heightened sense of urgency in December. What I do recall is that I dealt with it when I had time to do it." And now for my second example of prosecutorial fudge-making. The managers have devoted much attention to the magic date of December 11th.